Every time she fired him, he thanked her. Not sarcastically, genuinely. "Thank you," he'd say, and then he'd leave. Nobody fires someone and gets thanked for it. Until you hear why. The night the bank letter arrived, Talia Summers didn't open it. She set it on the corner of her desk, face down, the way you'd set down something that might bite. She already knew what it said. She'd known for weeks, the same way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color. Outside her office window, the factory floor sat half-lit, half the machines silent, because half the orders that used to keep them running had gone overseas years ago and never come back. Her father built this place in a different world. A world where a factory whistle meant something, where a paycheck from Summers Manufacturing put 3 meals on a table and a roof that didn't leak. Talia had inherited it in 1987 along with a single instruction her father repeated so often it stopped sounding like advice and started sounding like scripture. Keep people employed, and the town survives. For 30 years, she'd kept her end of it. She knew every worker's name. She'd stood at their weddings. She'd sat in folding chairs at their funerals. She'd made sure the health insurance never lapsed, even in years when the factory's own books were bleeding red. But scripture doesn't pay creditors. Her daughter Keisha, an accountant 3 hours away in Atlanta, had said it to her plainly on the phone more times than Talia could count. The numbers don't work. Mom, you have to make a choice. Talia never made it. She'd rather drain her own savings account down to nothing than stand in front of 60 families and tell them she'd failed them. And failure, to Talia, had always looked exactly like asking for help. On the night she left that letter face down on her desk, Talia Summers had maybe 90 days left before someone else decided what happened to everything her father built. She didn't know yet that the answer to her problem was about to walk through the front gate, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too thin for the weather, asking for work he had absolutely no business needing. He showed up on a Tuesday, no truck, no bag, just a jacket that looked like it had crossed more state lines than he had that morning. Talia was at her desk when someone from the floor knocked and said there was a man out front asking for the owner. She almost said send him away. Instead, tired enough to want a distraction from her own numbers, she told them to bring him in. He didn't have a resume. When she asked what he'd done before, he answered the way a man answers when he's telling the truth and knows it won't sound like it. A little of everything, manufacturing, construction, some finance work a long time ago. She asked for references. He said he didn't have any that would hold up. She almost laughed at the honesty of it. She told him she could promise a week, maybe 2, and that was only if he kept up. He said that was fair, shook her hand, and started the next morning like the conversation had already been settled in his favor. Within 3 days, the floor felt different. Machine 7 had been running hot for months, and he fixed the cooling line without anyone asking him to. The finishing chemicals had drifted slightly off ratio, quietly ruining color quality for weeks, and he corrected it before lunch on his second day. He learned names. He asked about people's kids and remembered the answers the next morning. Talia watched the energy on her own factory floor shift in a way she hadn't felt in years, and instead of relief, she felt something close to fear. A stranger walks in and fixes things she couldn't fix herself. That doesn't feel like luck. That feels like something she doesn't understand standing too close to everything she has left. She called him into her office before the sun came up, the room lit only by the blue glow of her monitor. She asked him straight out who had sent him. He looked genuinely confused and told her nobody had sent him, that he'd simply come home and wanted to help. It was the kind of answer that should have settled things, except she'd heard him on the phone the day before, out by the loading dock, using words like acquisition and stakeholders, words that didn't belong to a drifter working for minimum wage. She told him she couldn't keep someone around she didn't understand. She told him he was done, effective immediately, and she didn't soften it. He didn't argue. He nodded, turned toward the door, and just before he reached it, he stopped and said 2 words. Thank you. She assumed she'd misheard him, or that it was some bitter parting shot dressed up as politeness. She didn't ask him to explain it. She watched him cross the parking lot instead, phone already at his ear, and his voice had changed into something she hadn't heard from him before, low and certain, a voice used to being obeyed. Move forward with the Riverside acquisition, she heard him say. Full scope. I don't care about the timeline anymore. For days later, construction crews showed up at a warehouse that had sat boarded up for 5 years. A week after that, The local paper ran a headline about an $8 million investment firm buying commercial property across Riverside, with plans for a tech hub, a jobs training center, a rebuilt community space. Someone with real money had landed in her town overnight, and she had just fired him without asking his last name twice. Before we go any further, I want to be honest with you. I do not know your name, but I know that a story like this only exists because somebody like you stays to hear it. Please subscribe, like, and share this with someone who could use a good story tonight. And if you have a moment, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Your city, your country, whatever you are comfortable sharing. I will reply to every comment personally. Thank you for staying. Because I should warn you now, this story does not end the way you think it does. There is something Talia does not know about the man she just fired, and by the time you find out, you will understand why I had to tell it. 5 weeks passed before he walked back through the gate. He asked for Talia by name, like a man who had rehearsed the request more than once on the drive over. She should have said no. Instead, desperation had worn her pride down just enough that she gave him 2 weeks, probation only, and immediately the factory started breathing again. Orders came in from companies that wanted their labels stamped Made in America. Machines that had sat silent for years ran at full capacity for the first time since she could remember. One of those machines belonged to a woman named Ruth Coleman, who'd worked the finishing line for 26 years and had been 2 paychecks from losing her house before Marcus arrived. Talia watched Ruthan's daughter come by the factory one afternoon just to hug her mother in the parking lot, because the mortgage company had called off the foreclosure that morning. It was the kind of thing Talia used to be able to promise her workers, back when the factory could still afford promises. Seeing it happen because of a stranger's money instead of her own sat wrong in her chest, even while she was grateful for it, and she couldn't have explained the difference to anyone who asked. Then her brother David drove up from Charlotte, sat across from her at the kitchen table that night instead of the office, and set a folder down between them like he didn't trust himself to hand it to her directly. I had somebody look into him, David said. 48 hours, that's all it took, and that should scare you more than it would scare me. He opened the folder to a single page, mostly blank. No social security record for a Marcus Reed going back 20 years. No driver's license. No credit history anywhere in the country. A man's been standing in your building every day for weeks, David said. And on paper, he doesn't exist. You don't know what that money's tied to, Talia. You don't know what it cost you down the road to take it. Talia sat with the folder a long time after David left. She wanted to defend Marcus and couldn't find the words, because David wasn't wrong about any of it. The next morning, before she decided anything, she found Marcus stacking finished bolts of fabric near the loading dock and asked him straight out. I need you to tell me something true, she said. Who were you talking to yesterday about an acquisition? And don't tell me it's nothing, because I know what that word means. He set the bolt down slowly, like he was buying himself a few seconds. It's business I'm handling on the side, he said. It doesn't touch you or this factory. She pressed him. Then why does it sound like you're running something a lot bigger than a factory floor? He looked at her for a moment too long before he answered. Because I am, he said. But I promise you, Talia, none of it is going to hurt you. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and she could feel the gap between the two even if she couldn't name it. That gap sat with her all day. That night, walking the loading dock to clear her head, she caught his voice again through the cracked office window, something about a warehouse investment and a timeline that needed to stay flexible, spoken in that same low, certain register he'd used with her that morning. She didn't understand half of what he said. She understood enough. The next morning her voice was quieter than the first time, sadder, when she told him it was over and asked him not to come back. He looked at her like he wanted to say something that might change her mind. He didn't. He just said, "Thank you." The same 2 words, and walked out into the lot. This time she stood at the window longer than she meant to, turning the phrase over in her head. Thank you. Not for a paycheck. Not for anything she'd given him, because as far as she could tell she'd given him nothing but 2 rejections in 5 weeks. She didn't have an answer, and she didn't yet have the nerve to go looking for one. So she did what she always did with the things that scared her. She went back to work and let the questions sit unopened, the same way that bank letter had sat on her desk. Talia drove past the old warehouse district one morning on her way to the bank and had to pull over. A jobs training center had opened where a tire shop used to sit boarded up, and there was a line out the door. People her own workers' age holding folders of certification paperwork they hadn't had to pay a dime for. 3 storefronts she'd watched go dark one by one over the last decade now had fresh paint and lease signs in the windows. She asked a woman in line who was behind it, and the woman shrugged and said some investment group. Nobody seemed to know a name. Talia started asking around anyway, and every answer led back to the same firm. And every thread on that firm led back to a name that made her stomach drop a little further each time she heard it. One night, unable to sleep, she pulled an old yearbook down from a closet shelf she hadn't touched in years. Riverside High, 1985. There he was, younger, thinner, an arm around a woman at graduation, the caption underneath reading Marcus Reed, full scholarship to Duke University. She tracked down a retired teacher, Mrs. Helen Cohen, who remembered him clearly. Brilliant, quiet, raised by a mother named Eleanor who worked double shifts as a nurse to keep him in that school. Eleanor died of cancer in 1989. Marcus came home for the funeral and never came back after that. People said he couldn't stand to be in Riverside without her. Talia sat back in her chair, the yearbook still open on her lap, because she remembered Eleanor Reed. She'd brought her flowers once, during her illness. Brought food to her apartment on nights she was too weak to stand at a stove. Stood at her funeral among a handful of people who bothered to show up for a woman most of the town had already forgotten. She'd done it decades ago expecting nothing in return, and had genuinely forgotten she'd ever done it at all, until a name in an old yearbook brought it back in one sitting. 2 weeks later he came back a third time. He didn't ask for work. He walked straight into her office and shut the door behind him. "Talia, I need you to listen to something," he said. "I need you to let me help. Not as an employee. As someone who—" She cut him off before he could finish. Her voice cracked as she told him she wanted nothing from him, that she needed him gone, out of her factory and her town, for good this time. He didn't move right away, something unsaid sitting heavy behind his eyes. Then he said it again. "Thank you." Only this time his voice broke slightly on the second word, and he was gone before she could ask him why a man she'd just rejected for the third time sounded like he was thanking her for something far bigger than a job. "I need to ask you something before we keep going. Have you ever heard someone say thank you, and known, somewhere underneath, that they weren't thanking you for what you thought they were thanking you for?" Sit with that for a second, because Talia is about to find out exactly what she was being thanked for, and it is going to break something open in her. Tell me in the comments if you've ever caught yourself replaying somebody's words long after they said them. I will reply to every comment personally. If you haven't already, subscribe now, because what happens next is the reason I had to tell this story at all. That third thank you wouldn't leave her alone the way the first two hadn't. She hired Shonda Pierce, a private investigator out of Charlotte with a reputation for patience, and gave her 3 weeks. Shonda worked out of a small office above a hardware store, and when Talia came in for the update, there were 3 folders laid out on the desk in order, oldest lead to newest. "I'll tell you where I started, because it matters," Shonda said. "My first guess was a corporate buyer. Somebody positioning to acquire half the commercial real estate in Riverside cheap, then flip it once the town came back. That's the ordinary version of this story." She tapped the first folder and pushed it aside. "It's not what's happening here. The Jobs Training Center is free. The community center renovation didn't come with a naming clause. Nobody's profit margin explains what this money is doing." The second folder had taken Shonda down a darker road for a few days. The absence of any paper trail on Marcus himself, no address, no employer, no history anyone could verify, had made her wonder if the money moving through Riverside was being cleaned through the town rather than invested in it. She'd spent the better part of a week chasing that theory through bank filings and construction permits before she found the piece that killed it. Every contractor, every vendor, every payroll check tied to the projects was documented, licensed, and taxed the ordinary way. Whatever this was, it wasn't hiding anything illegal. It was hiding a person. The third folder held the part that actually moved things forward. The investment firm rebuilding Riverside traced through a shell company, then a holding company, then an anonymous trust built specifically to keep somebody's name off every document filed with the state. "Whoever set this up paid real money to stay invisible," Shonda said. "But invisible people leave a shape, even when they don't leave a name." The shape, once she laid it out, matched a timeline down to the month. A man who'd left Riverside for Duke in the mid-1980s. A mother who'd worked as a nurse in this town. A reappearance the same month Talia's loan came due. Talia didn't need Shonda to say the name out loud. She already had it. What she still didn't understand was why a man with that kind of money would risk being fired 3 times by a woman who barely trusted him, when he could have rebuilt her town without ever standing in the same room as her. So she started pulling at threads closer to home. On a Sunday call with Keisha, meant to be about nothing more than a recipe, her daughter mentioned a new client in Atlanta almost as an afterthought. He asked me the strangest questions, Keisha said. Not about the business. About Riverside. Whether I still had family there, whether I ever went back. I figured he was just being friendly, but it felt like an interview. What's his name? Talia asked, keeping her voice as level as she could manage. Marcus Reed, Keisha said. Why, do you know him? Talia stood in her kitchen holding the phone against her ear, staring at a spot on the wall, trying to decide how much to say to a daughter 3 hours away who had no idea her own client and her mother's mystery investor were the same man. I've met him, Talia finally said, choosing the smallest true thing she could offer. He worked at the factory for a little while. Keisha laughed, not unkindly. Small world. He's polite, a little intense, asks better questions than most of my actual clients. Talia let her go on for another minute about nothing, unable yet to explain what she was only starting to understand herself. He hadn't just been investing in a town from a distance. He'd been circling her family for months, quietly, patiently, building a relationship with her daughter under his own name while he let Talia know him only as a stranger who kept getting fired. She found him at sunset in the half-finished lobby of the Innovation Hub, standing at the windows overlooking a town that was, undeniably, coming back to life beneath him. Construction dust still hung in the air, catching the last light through glass that hadn't been cleaned yet. I know who you are, she said. He didn't turn around right away. Took you long enough, he said, and there was no cruelty in it, just tiredness. Her anger got there before her curiosity did. You let me fire you 3 times, she said. You let my brother tell me you might not exist. You let me hire a private investigator to chase down a man I could have just asked. Why would you let me go through all of that instead of just telling me who you were? He didn't answer right away, and the silence made her angrier, until he finally said, because the moment I told you, you'd have stopped seeing yourself as the one saving this town. You'd have started seeing yourself as somebody's charity case. I know you well enough to know that would have cost you more than the factory ever could. When he finally spoke about himself directly, he said, leaving here after my mother died felt like escaping something shameful. I spent 30 years building a fortune while running from the one place that actually made me. Coming back made me ask what any of it was worth if the woman who sacrificed everything for me never lived to see it. I remember you, he told her. You brought my mother flowers when she was sick, the cheap kind from the gas station on 3rd Street, because that's what was open at that hour. You brought food to our apartment on the nights she couldn't stand at the stove, in a dish you never asked back for. You stood at her funeral when half this town had already forgotten she existed. I was 17 years old, standing in the back of that church, and I remember your face because you were crying like you'd actually known her, not like you were just being polite. I've carried that for 30 years, and I never found a way to give it back, because giving it back never felt like the right word for what you did. He turned the ring on his own finger as he spoke, an old, thin band that didn't match the rest of him, nothing like the watch on his other wrist. This was hers, he said, catching Talia looking at it. I've worn it every day since the funeral. People assume it means I'm married. I've never corrected anyone, because the truth felt like more than most conversations could hold. He held his hand out slightly, not offering it to her, just letting her see it in the fading light. She had almost nothing when she died. This and a paid-off headstone plot were the only things in her name. I built an empire, Talia, and the only thing I've never once considered selling is a $200 ring. Then he told her about Keisha. He'd become her client in Atlanta well over a year before he ever set foot back in Riverside, for reasons that had nothing to do with Talia at all. It wasn't until Keisha mentioned her mother's name in passing, during an ordinary conversation about a factory struggling to stay open, that he understood exactly whose daughter he'd been sitting across a desk from all along. I didn't go looking for her, he said. She found me first, in a manner of speaking. But once I knew whose daughter she was, I couldn't stop thinking about it. About whether the woman who fed my mother 30 years ago was still out there fighting the same fight. I didn't invest in a town, Talia. I invested in my mother's memory. and in a debt I've been carrying since I was young enough to watch her work herself past exhaustion just to keep me fed. Talia was quiet for a while, looking out at the same lights he'd been looking at when she walked in. "I owe you an apology before you say anything else," she said. "I fired you 3 times because I was afraid of what I didn't understand, and I never once asked myself if I was wrong to be afraid. My father built this factory on trusting people who earned it, and I threw that away the first week you walked in, because trusting you felt more dangerous than losing everything on my own." He shook his head slightly. "You don't owe me an apology, Talia. You owe yourself one. For 30 years of believing help was something to be ashamed of." She let that sit for a moment before she said, "None of that explains the thank you. 3 times I threw you out of my building, and 3 times you thanked me like I'd done you a favor. That's not gratitude for a memory 30 years old. That's something else." He looked at her like he'd been waiting for exactly that question, and like he'd been dreading it at the same time. She asked him the question that had been sitting under every conversation since the first firing. Why, every single time she rejected him, had he thanked her on his way out the door? He went quiet for a long moment before he answered. 8 months before I ever walked into your factory," he said. "A doctor in Boston told me I had 2 years left, at most. It's been moving quietly for a while now. They caught it too late for anything that changes the outcome." He looked out at the town instead of at her. Coming back to Riverside was never only about settling old debts. It was about spending whatever time I have left in the one place, and with the one family, that ever made me feel like more than a number in a portfolio. For a moment Talia refused to believe it, the way anyone refuses the first time. "You don't look sick," she said, which she knew even as she said it wasn't an argument, just a reflex. "You've been running a factory floor. You've been standing in construction sites for months. People who are dying don't do that." He gave her something close to a smile. "People who are dying do exactly that, Talia, when they've decided how they want to spend what's left. I'm not going to spend my last months in a hospital bed if I can spend them here instead." She asked him why he'd never told her, not even once, not even when she was screaming at him to leave her building for good. "Because the day I tell you," he said, "you stop seeing me as a man who came home. You start seeing me as a dying man you have to be gentle with. I've had 8 months of people being gentle with me, and I came back to Riverside because I wanted one place left in the world where somebody would still yell at me like I mattered enough to yell at. Every time you fired me," he said, "I wasn't losing a job. I was losing a day I wasn't going to get back, and I don't have many of those left to spend. But I thanked you anyway, because every single time, I still got to see you again. I still got to stand in the town my mother loved. I got one more small piece of a homecoming I spent 30 years avoiding." That gratitude was never sarcasm, Talia. It was the truest thing I had left to give anybody. Talia stood there in silence, understanding for the first time exactly what she'd been rejecting 3 separate times. Not a stranger, not a threat. A dying man spending his last months trying to hand her family a future he wouldn't be part of, thanking her every time she sent him away because even her rejection meant one more day in the town that made him who he was. She never fired him again, because there was nothing left to fire him from. He wasn't an employee anymore. He was something closer to family, standing beside her on the factory floor, funding a vocational program for the town's kids, spending his remaining time exactly where he wanted it spent. Keisha moved home from Atlanta once she understood how little time he had left, and the two of them worked side by side on the business end of the innovation hub, closer by then than a client and her advisor had any business being. Ruth and Coleman retired that spring after 27 years on the finishing line, and at her send-off in the break room, she told anyone who'd listened that she'd kept her house because of 2 people in that room, and pointed at both of them. Talia stood there holding a paper cup of punch, thinking that this, more than any ribbon cutting or headline, was what her father's whole promise had actually been about. The Innovation Hub opened with Talia and Marcus cutting the ribbon together, both of them looking at each other instead of the camera. The photograph ran in every regional paper as proof of what a town looks like when it decides to believe in itself again. But the real change had nothing to do with buildings. Talia learned, in the months she had left with him, that accepting help doesn't diminish what you've built. It completes it. She learned that a man who thanks you for rejecting him isn't confused. He's simply run out of time to wait for you to be ready, and has chosen gratitude anyway. Marcus Reed died 14 months after he first walked through her gate. In his last weeks, When he could no longer make it out to the factory floor, Talia started coming to him instead, pulling a chair up beside his bed in the evenings to tell him how the day had gone. The last time she saw him conscious, she took his hand and said the two words back to him for the first time in 18 months. "Thank you." He smiled like it was the only thing he'd been waiting to hear. He spent those final months exactly where he wanted to be, in Riverside, beside Keisha, beside the woman who had once shown his mother kindness and later gave him something he never expected on his way out the door the third time. Forgiveness for staying away so long, and a place to belong again before the end. Talia kept the factory running. She kept the innovation hub growing. And she told this story to anyone who would listen, not because a billionaire rebuilding a dying town was remarkable on its own, but because of what he taught her about the people we push away without ever understanding what they're actually offering us. People still ask her sometimes if she regrets firing him 3 times. She tells them no, every time, because his gratitude taught her something it took her 30 years to learn on her own. Help isn't a threat to your pride. And the people who keep showing up for you, even after you've told them not to, are usually the ones running out of time to say what they came to say. I need to ask you something before you go. If someone in your life is trying to help you right now, and you keep pushing them away, I want you to think about Marcus and about how much time any of us actually have. Tell me in the comments if this story changes how you'll answer the next time someone offers you help. I will reply to every comment personally. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who needs to hear about a man like that tonight. Thank you for watching.